Hi, it's John, and today we're going to take a look at the Nikon 24mm f1.7 for the Z mount crop bodies. I'll share photos I've taken with the lens, as well as comparing the image quality of the lens with the 28mm f2.8 FX lens, the 24-70 f4 zoom, and the 16-50 crop lens. The 24mm f1.7 is a crop lens and gives a field of view equivalent to a 36mm lens on the full-frame sensor. Like the other Nikon DX lenses, if you mount the 24mm to a full-frame body, the body will automatically force the camera into DX image size with a corresponding 36mm field of view. You can see the DX warning flashing on the LCD screen of my Z8. So I think a lot of people will cross-shop the 24mm f1.7 with the 28mm f2.8 full-frame lens, as they are close in focal length and are similarly priced. They share a similar build and are very similar in size. If you're shooting both DX and FX Nikon bodies, the 28mm has an immediate advantage of providing a 42mm field of view on crop bodies, as well as a notional 28mm on full frame. And another direct alternative is the Nikon 26mm f2.8 FX lens. The 26mm is a good bit smaller despite being a full frame lens, but it's twice the price and is limited to f2.8. While I've not tested that lens, it's reportedly sharp in the center, decently sharp at the DX corners, but a little weak wide open in the FX corners. If you want the smallest lens, the 26mm is the way to go and gives you the ability to shoot full frame. But if you want the faster aperture and cheaper price and don't mind a slightly softer lens, the 24mm f1.7 is a solid alternative for crop body photographers. And while a comparison could be made with the 24mm f1.8 lens, I don't think anyone will be meaningfully cross-shopping the 24mm f1.7 with a lens that has an MSRP of $1,000 and is substantially bigger. Okay, so let's get back to the 24mm f1.7. The lens was released in June 2023 and retails for $275. I saw the lens on B&H's used section for $220, so I couldn't resist snapping it up, as the f1.7 aperture in a small package was appealing to me. Let's take a look at the construction of the lens. It's compact at just 1.58 inches and 135 grams. Here's a camerasize.com comparison of the lens without its lens hood against the Nikon 28 f2.8 and the Nikon 26 f2.8. It's a little smaller than the 28mm, but it's definitely bigger than the Pancake 26. And while we're on the subject of the lens hood, it's an unusual design in that it's pretty tiny and screws directly onto the lens. Unless you really need the smallest camera and lens combo, I think it'll stay attached to the lens for most of the time. And this is from someone who generally avoids lens hoods. The lens hood on the 24 f1.7 has a filter thread, so it's possible to screw a filter either directly to the lens or to the lens hood itself. The lens is obviously built with cost and weight in mind. It's constructed of polycarbonate all the way to the lens mount. Given the weight of the lens, the lack of a metal mount isn't a practical issue. I own the 50-250 DX lens and I've used it extensively in the 4 years I've owned it. The 50-250 is a more substantial lens than the 24mm, coming at 405 grams, but the mount is showing minimal signs of wear. While it's obviously not a premium build, I think in practice the lens is tightly constructed and handles everyday use. The 24mm seems to be constructed similarly to the 40mm f2 and the 28mm f2.8. But subjectively, I think it feels just a little more solidly built, though I suspect it's just that the 24mm feels a little more dense due to its slightly smaller size. And consistent with the 40mm and 28mm lenses, there's no manual focus switch on the lens. While Nikon's implementation of manual focus ring override of autofocus is cleverly done, there are times when you just want to shoot in full-time manual focus. A manual focus switch right next to the focus ring would help on those occasions, rather than having to dig into the eye menu. Moving on to weather resistance, Nikon describes the weather sealing in the lens as being dust and drip resistant. I've not tested the lens in bad weather, but reviews I've consumed say the lens has been reliable in rain showers. So like the 26, 28 and 40mm lenses, the lens does not have VR. When it's paired with one of Nikon's crop sensor bodies, there will be no image stabilization, as those bodies lack the IBIS found in the full frame Z bodies. So if you're planning on taking long exposures, you'll need to find a way of stabilizing the camera with, say, a tripod. Nikon doesn't allow EVR to be used in stills photography. One design choice that is noteworthy is that the minimum aperture is limited to f11, where most lenses go to f16 and frequently beyond. It doesn't impact my photography, but your use case may well be different. Now let's take a look at how the lens performs for video work. the 24mm f1.7 generally focuses fast and is reasonably confident in achieving focus. Though close up, it sometimes racks backwards and forwards before actually achieving focus. Generally, this is pretty quick and reliable, but the lens does have some obvious focus breathing when racking from minimum focus distance to infinity. After testing the lens at minimum focus distance, I moved my model, the lovely Lady Liberty, to around 2 feet, and you can see that the focus breathing is significantly reduced compared to the minimum focusing distance. At most practical distances and focus racks, I think this won't be much of a factor. Its small size works well on a compact gimbal and is easy to rig up for an overhead shot. Despite its wideish focal length, its wide aperture allows for some usable separation between the subject and the background. Moving on to autofocus noise, I tested the autofocus using the ZFC's inbuilt mics. It's generally pretty quiet and it's similar to the 28mm f2.8, which itself is a pretty quiet lens. It's definitely quieter than the 40mm f2, which itself is not a loud lens. With any level of ambient noise, the AF noise will likely not be an issue. As previously mentioned, the lens does not have VR, so when used with one of Nikon's DX bodies, there's no image stabilization. Handheld video doesn't look too bad due to the wideish field of view, but there is some noticeable jitter. This is improved by using EVR, though it does crop the image a small amount. The focus ring is nicely damped and has more resistance than either the 20mm f2.8 or the 40mm f2. It turns smoothly and is quiet in operation, unlike my version of the 40mm f2, which has a noticeable noise when it is rotated. As of April 2024, linear manual focus is supported in a number of bodies including the Z8, Z9, Z6 II and Z7 II for a limited number of lenses. I assume the 24mm f1.7 would not have this capability, as the 28mm f2.8 and 40mm f2 do not allow manual focus. I searched Nikon's website and couldn't find mention that the lens supported linear focus, so I popped it on my Z8 and was surprised to find that the custom option f9 was active. I tested the lens to see whether linear manual focus actually works and was happy to see that the function did. The ZFC and Z50 can do linear focus as they respond to changes to that switch on my Tamron 150 to 500, but without a switch on the lens, the function isn't supported on those crop bodies. If you want to use linear manual focusing with the 24mm f1.7, you'll have to use it on one of the supported full-frame bodies, which seems a curious design choice. And given we have fully articulating screens on the Z30 and ZFC, it's reasonable to ask whether the lens would be good for vlogging. With an effective field of view of 36mm, the lens is pretty much too narrow for that use. I'm not much of a vlogger, but the general consensus is that around 20mm full frame is about right for most people. And since there's no stabilization in the lens or the body, the image will be a little jittery unless you're using EVR. EVR is definitely helpful here, but it's at the price of a small crop, meaning that the field of view is narrower still. Even though it's a nice light setup with the Z30 or ZFC, I don't think vlogging is a typical use case for this lens. So overall for video use, this is an adequate but less than stellar lens. So let's take a look at the image quality of the lens and see how it stacks up to some other lenses with similar focal lengths. I'm going to compare the 24mm f1.7 to the 28mm f2.8, the 16 to 50mm DX lens at 24mm, and the 24 to 70 f4 lens also at 24mm. I'll shoot on the ZFC and adjust the position of the tripod to get the same field of view with the 28mm so we can compare the images more directly. So I went up to the Ulysses S. Grant Memorial at 125th and Riverside on Manhattan's Upper West Side. I've used the memorial before as a test subject, as it's a good test of sharpness for wide-angled lenses at real-world distances. I put the ZFC on the tripod and leveled it up using the K&F 3-way geared head. The corners of the image are in the same focal plane as the front of the colonnade, so we can look at the sharpness across the frame. With the 24mm f1.7, we can see that the image improves as we stop down from f1.7 to f2.8 and then to f4. And we're getting little additional improvement stopping down from f4 to f5.6. The center of the image improves as we stop down, but it's the corners that really benefit as we shrink the aperture. Now let's see how the 24mm f1.7 compares to the 28mm f2.8 FX lens on the crop sensor. The effective field of view here is 42mm full frame, so I moved the tripod slightly further away from the memorial to get the same framing as with the 24mm f1.7. So like the 24mm lens, the 28mm sharpens up as we stop down. The 28mm has slightly higher acuity and is more consistent across the DX frame than the 24mm is at corresponding apertures. But obviously the 28mm can only open up to f2.8 rather than the f1.7 of the 24mm lens. Now let's compare all four lenses at f4. The 16-50 kit lens is clearly less sharp than the other three. The 24mm is appreciably better than the 16-50 kit lens, which you would expect. But as mentioned before, it's slightly less sharp than the 28mm at f4. Between the 28mm and the 24-70, I think the center of the image is very similar, with maybe the 28mm slightly out-resolving the 24-70, but I'd have to give the edge to the 24-70 f4 at the DX corners, but it's close. The story broadly continues when we compare the lenses at f5.6. The 16-50 sharpens up but remains the worst performer of the bunch. But to be fair, it's no slouch, especially for the price that it goes for in various DX body kits. But unsurprisingly, it's just not as good as the 2 primes or the S-line zoom. At f5.6, the 24mm isn't noticeably better than it is at f4, and it continues to lag behind the 28mm and the 24-70. And finally, if we compare the 24-70 to the 28mm, the outcome is similar to that at f4, but I'd argue that the center of the frame on the 24-70 is a whisker sharper than the 28mm. If we were to compare the full frame corners on the 28mm to those on the 24-70, the 24-70 very clearly pulls ahead. Check out my recent review of the 28mm for that comparison. One final data point is that the 24mm at its widest aperture of f1.7 is the worst performer in this test. Opening up the 16-50 to its maximum aperture of f4.2 provides a better image. Stopping the 24mm down to f2.8 ultimately eliminates this advantage. Okay, so now let's take a look at the close focusing capabilities of the lens. Its minimum focusing distance is just 18 centimeters, though the reproduction ratio is a pretty pedestrian 0.19 times. I took some test shots at around 19 centimeters to see how the image held up at close distance, and similar to the 40mm f2 and the 28mm f2.8, the image is pretty weak wide open and the corners are poor. The image gets better as we stop down. This is especially true on the edges and corners of the frame. They aren't what you would call sharp even at f5.6, but they are much more usable than at f1.7 and f2.8. I repeated the test at around 32 centimeters and the image starts to look a little better, but it's not as dramatic an improvement as we saw with the 28mm f2.8. Let's take a look at the lens's handling of chromatic aberration and coma. While the construction of the lens is similar to the 28mm and 40mm muffins, the handling of chromatic aberration is noticeably better than with those two lenses. While it is present in these torture tests, it's not the sea of magenta that we saw with the 40mm and 28mm lenses. This sequence starts with the lens wide open and then stopping down to f11. There is some magenta present in the image wide open at f1.7, which reduces as we stop down. By f5.6, it's much better controlled, and as we reach f11, it's pretty much eliminated. Now let's take a look at how the lens handles coma. Coma is clearly present in the corners wide open, but I think it's also less obvious than with the two cheap full-frame primes. The rendering wide open shows some coma around the specular highlights, which goes away as we stop down to f4 and beyond. Vignetting is usually handled by applying lens corrections, so it's not usually a practical issue. With the 24mm, the lens corrections largely take care of the vignetting, though you can see that the corners of the wide open image are a little darker than at, say, f5.6. This is pretty typical and can be easily corrected in post if needed. Eye detection and focus was an issue with the 40mm f2 when shooting up close and wide open. From my experience, the 24mm performs okay in this regard. Here are a couple of portraits I've grabbed of my lad Dex with the lens at f1.7. It's a pretty pleasing rendering to my eye. So let's take a look at some images I've taken with the lens. So let me share my overall assessment of the 24mm f1.7 lens. I think if you're a crop frame Nikon shooter interested in general photography, this lens is an interesting choice. And more so because of the lack of dedicated Nikon options for their crop bodies. Third-party manufacturers have stepped in to fill this void, and Viltrox, Sigma and others have given us some interesting choices. I haven't had the opportunity to shoot these lenses, but they cover a range of prices, focal lengths and quality, which is great for us DX owners. So back to the Nikon 24mm f1.7. While it's one of the least sharp Nikon lenses that I've used, there's still a decent amount of detail in the images produced. The corners are never particularly strong, but unless you're shooting landscape or architecture where corner sharpness is a necessity, this won't be much of a limitation for most styles of photography. Take a look at this image of our pup Dizzy. While it's not a great overall image, look at the details captured in her fur as we punch in. Committed pixel peepers may be left wanting, but most folks will be much more interested in the overall composition and look at the photo. There is little to complain about here. If you're a dedicated crop body shooter, I would recommend the 24mm if you want a faster companion to the 16-50 kit lens. The 24mm complements the 16-50 nicely in a couple of ways. While the VR in the 16-50 helps stabilize the image in low light, it can't freeze subject movement. The wider aperture of the 24mm gives you more latitude to keep shutter speeds up while keeping ISOs at manageable levels. The f1.7 maximum aperture allows for nice subject separation. The maximum aperture of the 16-50 at 24mm is only f4.2 and will render a more two-dimensional image. Here are a couple of comparisons of the looks we get with the two lenses wide open. So what about Z system users that own both full frame and crop bodies? If you don't own the 28mm already, it comes down to whether you need the extra 1 1/3 stops for low light and need slightly better subject separation. As I mentioned in my intro, the 28mm will give you the flexibility to shoot 28mm on your full frame body and a 42mm field of view on your crop body. And while you're giving up around a stop and a third with the 28mm, it does provide marginally better quality in a very similar form factor. So in summary, the 24mm f1.7 is a nice compact crop body lens that will produce decent images in most situations. If a 36mm effective field of view is something that appeals to you, you'll very likely enjoy this lens unless you're a devout pixel peeper or need edge-to-edge sharpness. So that wraps up this video. If you have any questions or your own observations about this lens, it would be great to hear your thoughts. Thanks for checking out the video. If it's been helpful, please like the video, subscribe and leave a comment below.